Everyone, welcome to our Q&A session. That's going to be a follow-up to our Rise of the Aztecs episode. In the past, I've done some of these for previous Moments episodes where the whole idea is to just take a look at the video, take a look at the comments, and kind of follow up on things that need to be corrected or expanded upon. In the past, what I've done is it was a live stream, but in this case, what I did is we're doing it kind of a different way where I collect all the questions beforehand, and it gives me a chance to work out some of the kinks and streamline it a bit more. So this is going to be just myself and the researcher Sean we'll be bringing on in just a second discussing. But to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing, it's going to be going through each of the main chapters of the video. So the origin, seeking a home, finding a place, vassals of the Tepenecs, and then uprising, Aztec Empire, a reign of the Tlatoani. So going through each of these, giving our own kind of fleshing out of each of these, touching on topics that you guys asked us to touch on, and then at the end we'll also have a bunch of kind of free-form questions that I've picked out from Facebook, Patreon, and other places as well. So with that being said, that's kind of the outline. And then now I want to bring on Sean Kiskel as well, who's going to be joining us for this discussion, who is our researcher. So Sean, maybe you can say hi and give us a bit of information about yourself.
Yeah, Julian, thanks for having me on. So my background is in anthropology. I have two undergraduate degrees. One of them is actually in anthropology. And although technically my my archaeology professor who got me turned on to Mesoamerica, it was a Mayanist who does a lot of research in kind of the coastal Maya region. The joke that I say is that after I graduated, I was so used to going to the library, I would just kind of automatically wake up and go. And I started reading. I was always fascinated by Mesoamerica, so I started just reading more about the Olmecs, and then I kind of got into the Aztecs, and I did that kind of independent study for a few years, and ended up finding myself on a board called AskHistorians on Reddit pretty early on in the kind of nascent period of its life, and that gave me a good springboard to kind of talk with other people who were in the field, both kind of as myself, kind of as hobbyists, and also people who were professional academic historians, and also just a great kind of forum to have people ask questions and for me to kind of push my own limits of what I knew. Because of course the best thing they say is, the best way to learn is to teach, and that gave me an opportunity. And so now and I think that's how you found me as well. And I was able to kind of put this hobby I've had for several years now to kind of good use.
Yeah, so it's been awesome. Like you said, you're over on Ask Historians, and that's a big resource for anyone who hasn't, familiarized themselves with it. I'll post a link below so you can see it. So that's how I found Sean and many others who we've brought on as guests. So yeah, that's awesome to see that you've been able to kind of find an interest and just take it and run, and then now we've found an audience. A lot of other people hopefully are inspired to dig in deeper, and that's what, as I said, this video is all about, is taking kind of the starter video, the primer that we did, and fleshing it out in a back and forth session, which is cool that we can do that now with YouTube and other social media platforms, etc. So yeah, now let's get into kind of some housekeeping stuff or house cleaning stuff that I wanted to do in the beginning, which is going to be, I'm first going to give a recap of the main misunderstood aspects of Rise of the Aztecs, touch briefly on the feedback we've gotten so far, and then offer some corrections that were to some errors that were made in the video. So the really brief overview of what we were trying to get at with Rise of the Aztecs was mainly to hit on a couple points. The first one is to talk about the origins of the Aztecs. A lot of the backstory that's typically lost, because most people learn about the Aztecs when they get discovered by Europeans, and you lose all the prehistory. So we wanted to make that clear. So that was kind of misunderstood. The other one is the fact that they're not necessarily as ancient as you would think, because with the discovery of the New World, it's more like you cut, some vines away and you uncover this ancient temple, and kind of you think that, okay, everything that's discovered is ancient or frozen in time in some sense. But the Aztecs were very much, new players on the block, had been developing and expanding their empire, and were cut short just in their rise by the Spanish. So the fact that they weren't ancient is an important one. We delved a bit into the nature of the Triple Alliance, fleshing out some misconceptions about what this empire, the Aztec Empire, was, what even the term Aztec means. And then lastly, the main thing that we want to touch on was kind of the overall level of development and sophistication of the society. So I think we touched on most of those. And to transition now into kind of feedback, I think many people were appreciative of this. A lot of people had known some of the facts and details, but putting it all together, especially in a concise video where you can see it all side by side, I think we got a lot of great reception and lots of views and lots of comments, which was awesome. And of those comments, there were some corrections that you guys pointed out. So like I said, I wanted to go back and do some housekeeping on this stuff. One of the main things is the corrections on pronunciation of words. So Sean had coached me on a lot of the pronunciations in Nawa, which were great, so they turned out well, but there are still some nuances that I missed out on. So maybe Sean, you can offer some insight there.
Yeah, so I mean, as we were kind of discussing, well, as I was kind of giving you a couple recordings and some syllabaries and some pronunciation guides that you could use, it's a difficult language if you're a primary English speaker to learn because it is a very literal foreign language, and there are a lot of sounds that do not really translate well into English. So, for instance, the O and the U in Nahuatl tend to be almost kind of interchangeable. If anybody's familiar with like how R and L kind of slurs together in say like Japanese, and I'm probably some Japanese linguist is going to tell me I'm wrong about this, but it's one of those phonemes that just is kind of in between. So if you're used to saying like an O or an oo, and then you're faced with these orthographic writings which have kulwa or kolwa, and you don't know which way to go, and you just kind of slur it together, it can be a little difficult. But so that's just one of the aspects. But there's also the TL at the end of words, which most people just kind of do a tl sound, like Quetzalcoatl, or what was some of the other ones that we had? It's coatl, things like that. It's not really a tl sound because it actually represents a sound that English doesn't have, which is a voiceless lateral alveolar fricative. If you're a Welsh speaker, it's the double L sound, which is kind of a kind of blowing sound out the side of your your mouth there. So modern kind of pronunciations of Nahuatl kind of drop that a little bit, and a lot of the more modern dialects, there's still a million plus Nahuatl speakers in Mexico and the United States today. They'll drop that TL, voiceless alveolar fricative, and just have kind of a hard T. So you see a lot of people teaching Nahuatl as Nahuatl, but the more classical pronunciation would be something more like Nahuatl, with that kind of, which I'm overemphasizing here, but Atlashinoli as kind of one of the phrases go to kind of learn it.
Mm-hmm. And the other major thing was where the pronunciation in the word goes. I think it's not in the last syllable, but the penultimate one.
Yeah, it's the penultimate syllable. And I think you mostly got, I mean, I was pretty impressed by how, never having done it before, you did a really good job on a lot of those. There's just some where, especially with some of the larger, conglomerations of words where you kind of stumbled a little bit. But yeah, overall, I was pretty pleased with the pronunciation. And I know most of the people I think I saw in the comments were saying like that you did a good job as well, but you could have done better.
Yeah, there's always room.
Yeah.
Well, great. Yeah, I'm glad we got to touch on that. I'm glad a lot of people picked up on it as well, both in appreciation, but then also, knowing enough to be able to point out the nuances and stuff. So that was awesome to see. So that was the first thing of housekeeping. A couple more that people pointed out. One was the depiction of Huitzilopochtli. The statuette that we had used as the basis for the artwork was actually an incorrect depiction. It's actually the mother of Huitzilopochtli. So maybe you can touch on that, Sean.
Yeah, so I noticed that right away as well. You actually used a very, 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 very famous of Coatlicue, who is the kind of quote-unquote mother of Huitzilopochtli. And that statue, it's actually, I think it's something like 8 feet tall. It's a very impressive statue. It's actually in the INA Museum down in Mexico City right now. So, but it's appropriate that you use that one, not only because she is, the mother of Huitzilopochtli, but the statue itself, I don't know if anyone wants to zoom into it, but she's depicted kind of without a head and kind of 2 snakes coming out. And that actually depicts essentially what is her decapitation. And the 2 snakes that come out kind of form her head are actually kind of representative, symbolic of like blood spurting out of the top of her neck. So that's kind of, the statue is representative actually of the birth of Huitzilopochtli. So Coatlicue is, per the mythology, kind of impregnated by a ball of feathers, and then all of her other children, the Huitznawa, the 400, were very angry about that, and they slew her. And Huitzilopochtli burst forth from her body through her decapitated neck, and then slew all of them in return. So it's at least an appropriate statue to use.
Yeah.
Also, I will say that I think there's maybe one statue of Huitzilopochtli. There's not a whole lot of statuary of him because
Hmm.
he does have this kind of a very sacred aspect, and B, because he was kind of the central god. I'm pretty sure there was probably, when the Spanish talk about smashing idols, Huitzilopochtli was probably chief among them right there. So
I see. Okay. Well, thanks for partially coming to my defense that there weren't many examples. Let's see. The next one was the location of Tizapan. This one's a relatively minor one, but in our depiction, when the Aztecs are kind of wandering around the Valley of Mexico, one of the places that we said they settled was in Tizapan. I had it located to the west, which is actually more uh, aligned with the modern location of, I believe, a city of Tizapan, but in reality, kind of the ancient one, people think is closer to Culhuacan, so it would have been further to the east. So that's a minor correction. Another small one that people pointed out was Itzcuat, or Itzquash.
just go eat squat. And you'll be
Squat. Okay.
fine.
Yeah, the reign. There's a little typo. It said 1247 to 1440. People were like, "Oh my God, he's or 200 years old." No, it was a small typo. It should have been 1427 to 1440.
Yeah.
That's simple enough to correct.
Although I should point out that so another famous ruler who you mentioned in there,
Hmm.
Tezozomoc, who ruled Azcapotzalco and is kind of a major player in the early history here. He's said to have lived to like 120 or something like that. Um, so the
Yeah,
so that we do have a little bit of that long reign mythology, but
I
just
see.
not with its squad.
Yeah, got it. Let's see. And then the last bit of housekeeping was the final depiction of the Aztec Empire shows this like tongue of territory that goes out to the southeast. And there's debate over, if you're going to accurately represent a map, how much of that do you color in? Do you make the connection? Do you leave it as a pocket? So Sean, maybe you can touch on that detail.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the reason is that when we look at the kind of idea of drawing maps and borders with precise lines on a map is kind of more of a modern idea. I think there's a book by an anthropologist whose name I forget, but I think it's called Historical Fictions or something like that, which talks about kind of how the sheer act of drawing a map is an imperial project where you say, haha, we lay claim to all this. But a lot of times, particularly with very pre-modern states, you don't have that level of saying this is the border. In strict border control, you have these kind of more spheres of influence. So that area down in what is kind of, well, right now it's called Soconusco, and it's right on the border of the between Mexico, the modern state of Mexico, and the modern state of Guatemala. With the state of Mexico being Chiapas there. And that's actually a pretty ancient and old region, and it's pretty Xoconochco is the Nahua term for it. And the reason the Aztecs were going all the way down there is because it's a major center for cacao production. And so going down there was kind of seizing seizing the means of production, I guess you could say. But it was seizing a very, very rich area. But there is kind of the question of like, well, did they really control that whole swath of territory going down there, or was it more kind of like this enclave of influence that they had? And I would lean more towards it being more kind of an enclave of influence, but at the same point, we do see a lot of kind of campaigns by the Aztecs and their military kind of in that area, which is called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, kind of the area that leads between the highlands of Mexico down into kind of the lowlands there, right where Mexico kind of like narrows down, and then the Yucatan Peninsula goes up towards the north. So, I mean, it definitely was an area where the Aztecs had a lot of influence at the time, but Xoconochco is just one of those areas where they directly had tribute payments coming from.
Hmm. Okay. Great. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So with that being said, I think we pointed out kind of some of the main issues we had with the episode. So hopefully that does kind of ease some of the comments that we've seen. So now what we're going to be doing is transitioning into kind of each of the chapters of the video, and fielding some questions that people had and maybe some clarification so we can beef out sections and touch on topics that we had to kind of excise from the original script. So yeah, let's transition over to that. All right, the first section is going to be origin. So this is the part in the video where we went way, way back to the kind of semi-legendary, I guess, diaspora or migrations coming out from the northwest, leaving Aztlan, and then traveling across the lands. So we did have some questions about this period. Maybe we could start with the first one, where someone asked, what was the nature of these migrations during the period, kind of in a larger sense. So let's start with that.
Yeah, so really the Aztecs, and again, this goes to this idea of the Aztecs aren't really ancient, and even in the terms of Mesoamerican history itself, they're pretty recent arrivals, kind of into the historical scene. Um, to really understand the migrations, we saw a hint of this when you talked about like all the other groups that left from Aztlan, like the Tepanecs and the Xochimilca, things like that. But really, what we see is that going back a few centuries before the Aztecs, when we go back to kind of like the 10th century or even a little bit before, what we see is um, kind of a general shift in the climate. And the area right above central Mexico, which is the Mexican Altiplano, is this kind of, it's an area between two mountains. It's high, it's dry, it's arid, and it's very susceptible to essentially a decline in rainfall, which is really what was happening in those centuries leading up to when we see the Mexica coming in. So in between, say, like the fall of Teotihuacan in like the 5th or 6th or 7th century, depending on how you want to do the dating. And then we have the rise of, say, all the groups like at Azcapotzalco and then the Mexica coming after in like the 13th or 14th centuries. What you have is this really kind of period where the area to the north of the Valley of Mexico dries out. And that pushes a lot of these people who were kind of semi-nomadic. They might settle down in some areas here and there. They might just be purely nomadic people. They might be interacting with other settled groups that are in more better watered areas. There's a place called the Bajío, which is the northwest of the Valley of Mexico, where we think a lot of these people came from, which was kind of a more settled area. That then, as the area dried out, it kind of forced all these people into more hospitable areas, a main key part of that being the Valley of Mexico. So part of the story that goes on behind the story of the Aztecs is that the Mexica come at the tail end of what we sometimes call like the Chichimec migrations, and the Chichimecs are the kind of wild semi-nomadic people to the north. And so there's all these groups like the Tepanecs and like the Xochimilca and like the Chalca who come streaming into the basin of Mexico, intermingling and kind of somewhat displacing, but a lot of times just intermarrying into these kind of more settled groups there, settling down, adopting a lot of the customs, and becoming quote unquote civilized. And so the Mexica show up at the very tail end of that when most of those groups had already kind of acclimatized to a more settled lifestyle.
Okay, and we have just a quick follow-up on this. So Potato Gabe here says, how far did the Nahua migrate? So hard to say exactly where they started since they were already kind of transitory. They were moving around. So kind of hard to say, but you're saying most of these people, the general migration center is kind of the Mexican highlands?
Yeah, but the Mexican highlands, stretch all the way up into the southwest of the United States. So I will say, so Nahuatl is part of what we call a Uto-Aztecan language group, which stretches all the way from kind of what is now the southwest United States down into essentially almost Central America with Papil. And so there's actually a lot of debate about, okay, well, where is the center of Uto-Aztec? And it's mostly, you think, kind of more up in like the northwest of what is now Mexico, kind of near the border of the, where the United States is kind of where we think is the linguistic group has its origin. And then from there we have a lot, because, Nahuatl people are not necessarily new in central Mexico. It's just that we see an additional strong push of people coming down in that kind of 10th century drying out period. But if you want, and people have made this claim to say, well, the Mexica came all the way down from, the four corners of the United States, which is probably not true. Probably if we look at the actual origins of the Mexica, they're probably more in like states like Guanajuato or Zacatecas, things that are just kind of a little bit to the north of the Valley of Mexico.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And about this kind of us trying to piece together where the origins of these migratory groups are, the Aztecs themselves were interested in that question as well. So maybe we can kind of put in this other question that someone had about a story of an Aztec expedition later on sent to find Aztlan.
Oh yeah, it's a very fascinating story. So the first Moctezuma, not the one who we see, Moctezuma Xocoyote, is the one that Cortez encounters. Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, who's his, I think, grandfather. I'd have to check in. Great grandfather, I think. he was one of kind of the first big imperial Aztec rulers. So he was kind of the first one who ruled a fully independent triple alliance and did a lot of the early conquests really outside of the basin and really made the Aztecs like that regional force to be recognized. So he put together this expedition to go visit the mythical land, the mythical homeland of Aztlan. And Diego de Ron, who's a Spanish chronicler who actually lived in Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, like kind of almost immediately after the conquest period, actually grew up in Mexico speaking Nahuatl, relates the story. But it's very, it's a lot more myth and legend than kind of like, Lewis and Clark, travel journey, where Moctezuma assembles all these wise men and soothsayers and magicians, and they go north, and then they encounter kind of a hermit who then changes them into birds, and then they fly to Aztlan, and then they experience a bunch of strange magical things going up there. As they climb up the mountain, they find themselves sinking into it, so they need to shed themselves of their worldly desires, and they get to the mountain, and then they fly back. So there is this kind of recognition of the Aztecs of saying, or at least the Mexica saying, we want to connect ourselves back to this mythical land, but it's not something that really gives us any clear idea about an actual physical location of Aztlan, which is something that gets debated a lot.
And then one of the things you mentioned here is that, okay, going from the Valley of Mexico, going to Aztlan, crazy stuff happens. But in the original sense, Aztlan to Mexico Valley, a lot of crazy stuff happens as well that we glossed over. And I think that's one of the things that you wanted to touch on, is some of the more interesting stories that we skipped over during the early Aztec days of wandering. So let's talk about that real briefly.
So, I mean, you have to kind of understand like these these kind of like sojourn traveling, travel myths that are part of the very early part of the Mexica history are very kind of allegorical, and they're kind of explaining the way that the world came to be. But there's a couple key things that you see in almost every kind of version of it. I think one of them you touched in the video, which is where Copil, who was the son of Malinali, who was essentially, as the Mexica were traveling along, Malinali was this very persuasive female leader who was also, a witch who would send insects to bite her enemies and things like that. And at some point, the Mexica were instructed by Huitzilopochtli to, in the night, just kind of decamp and leave her behind. And so she and her followers, per the legend, end up founding the city of Malinalco. And she gives birth to Copil, who then organizes the first attack on the Mexica when they settle at Chapultepec. So, and then it's his heart that gets torn out and thrown into the lake, and then becomes the founding site of Tenochtitlan. So there's like the great tying of legend there. There is also the story of the Huitznawa, the children of Coatlicue, attacking her to then give birth to Huitzilopochtli. But of course, that's very legendary. But my personal favorite actually deals with the origin of the people that are usually called the Tarascans, who are this powerful state to the northwest of the Aztec territory, and are pretty famous for giving them like their most concise defeat before the Spanish showed up. So the Tarascans they're actually the Tarascans is kind of the Spanish name for them. They actually call themselves the Purepecha. Are centered around this lake to the northwest of the basin of Mexico, Lake Pátzcuaro. And so the part of the origin myth of the Mexica is that as they're walking along, they settle at this lake, and it's very nice, and a lot of people want to stay, but Huitzilopochtli says, no, this isn't your promised land. You need to keep moving on. And so the ones who are devout to Huitzilopochtli, as everyone else is swimming in the lake, steal the clothes of those people who want to stay, and then run off, to continue their journey onto the basin of Mexico. And so the people who are in the lake come out, find that they have no clothes, and so they can't go chasing after the group that left, so they just decide to settle there, and they become the Purepecha. Now, ethnographically, linguistically, this doesn't make any sense. The Purepecha are a completely unrelated group. They even speak like a different language. It's a language isolate, and but as a kind of a just so story, it's terrific. Because it does show kind of the Mexica explaining like, well, all these other people, this is how they got there. And also the kind of the coded to that story is that the Purepecha had a different style of clothing
Yeah, I
from the
was gonna
Mexica.
say, yeah, they're probably
Yeah,
trying to
where they
explain it.
where they wore kind of like, more like robes. Um, or I guess, I don't know, togas for those of you who want to go more Roman with it. Whereas the Mexica were very famous, they wear like a breechcloth and a cape. And so the Mexica would always say, well, the reason the Purepecha don't wear breechcloths is because our ancestors stole their clothes so long ago.
Hmm.
And so they didn't have any.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, it's a lot of allegorical, and again, we're dealing with the stuff of like really mythology when we're talking about these early journeys, but it is kind of a fascinating look into kind of how the Mexica ordered the world around them.
Yeah, and it's funny also to see the progression as well of the Aztec pranks. First, steal your clothes. Next thing, flay your daughter. It starts to take a turn.
Yeah, they escalate pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah, 0 to 100. So that kind of takes us into maybe the next section here. That's a nice transition into seeking a home, which is where they've just stolen some clothes. They're giddy. They're riding that high. They arrive in the Valley of Mexico and try and see what they can do. So in this section, we talk about how they kind of move from place to place and are always kind of find themselves repulsed in one sense or another. So as we get into this, maybe we'll talk real briefly about this history up to this point. How reliable is it? Because at a certain point, a later Aztec emperor ends up ordering, I think, the burning or the destruction of previous codices and previous books, the issuing of new ones, and so they kind of rewrite their own history. So maybe you could touch on like how much of this, or where do we get this information from, and what are the different narrative biases?
Yeah, so a lot of these stories that we get, a lot of these like written histories that we have, we can actually kind of perversely thank the Spanish for. So there's a couple early Spanish friars like Motolinía, Diego Duran, Bernardino Sahagún, who wrote early histories. And what they did, particularly in the case of Sahagún and Duran, is that they went out and they just interviewed older people and said, tell us the story, the history of your people, tell us about this myth here, tell us about, this ruler here, and they collected those narratives. So in one sense, what we have is after the conquest and kind of the decades that came after it, is that we have kind of these early ethnographers who go around to people who were born before the Spanish came over, and collected all these histories. And that's important because the Spanish were pretty assiduous about burning, documents as they went through. But I would point out that the one thing that we should keep in mind is that, this wasn't like a fully literate society. There wasn't like a written Aztec language. We can definitely see a lot of like pictographic kind of customs that were used, and a lot of the investigation into kind of the Mexica and just generally Aztec written, well, quote unquote written documents, do say like, if we look here, you can see that they're doing kind of a proto language, like using a rebus, things like that. The famous one is that the glyph for teeth, teeth is pronounced tlanti, and the suffix tlan means like place of. So you see like a lot of places like Tenochtitlan that end with tlan, or Mazatlan, will be depicted as kind of with a little rebus thing. Like Mazatlan is shown as like a deer head with teeth at the bottom. Mazat, deer, Tlan, teeth, place of. So there's a lot of kind of conventions that go along there. But a lot of what these pictorial documents were used for was to kind of as kind of almost memory aids for a more oral transition or oral telling of history. So someone like Fernando de Alva Ixtlahuochitl, who was a nobleman who was descended from the ruling family of Texcoco, who lived during the early colonial period, he explicitly says that he was drawing upon his own collection that his family saved of pictorial documents to write his like literal written in Spanish history, written in Spanish and also written in Nahuatl, which is pretty important at the time as well. So as far as our actual sources of historical documents and primary sources go, they're not bad when it comes down to it. I think the joke is something like that. Like we have more primary Nahuatl documents than we do like primary Greek documents, from like ancient Greece. Which admittedly, it's a 2,000 years kind of difference there, but still, it's one of those things that these writings, these information is not as lost as we think. The other side of that is that the Mexica themselves, when they kind of became independent, formed the Triple Alliance, the Aztecs, is that the ruler Itzcoatl, he actually ordered the burning of documents, and this is recorded in the Mexica's own history, where he's not shy about it. He says, and then he ordered these old documents burned so that people wouldn't be led astray by lies. And essentially, basically, it's kind of a whitewashing Mexica history. But at the same point, we have people like, Fernando Ixtlilxochitl and Domingo Chimalpahin, Juan de Pomar, all these other either indigenous or essentially earlier mestizo writers from other areas in the Valley of Mexico, who had their own sources, who have their own stories they're telling. There's a famous document called the Annals of Cuautitlan, which is from a city up north in the northern part of the basin, which records a lot of history, kind of almost like a year-by-year basis, which would not have been affected by this burning of documents by Itzcoatl because it was outside of his dominion at that point, kind of things like that. Fernando Ixtlilxochitl had no reason that he would have had to burn, his family would have had to burn their documents at the time, kind of thing like that. So we get these other perspectives which help kind of confirm what we know about early Mexica history. But if we read something like Diego Duran, who writes a very Mexica-oriented history, it makes it seem like the Mexica are doing everything. They didn't need anybody's help. They were fully independent. They were ordained by, Huitzilopochtli to be the chosen people of the valley. And then when you read, these other outside perspective histories, you can see that they actually were kind of getting a lot of help and were not exactly always the most major player in the area.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out because it's something that I myself was not fully aware of when you start reading the text of the books and you start to, what's the saying? There's always like a saying of history. It's like
history is written by the victors.
Well, that too,
Yeah.
but also there's another one which is like more about people who know a little bit about history will have a certain narrative, and then once you know a little bit more, you think, oh, I'm going to go read this primary source, and then of course that's going to give me the true answer, but then that's going to lead you astray. You have to go even deeper and say, okay, now I have to go even further and like do a couple different sources.
Yeah,
So
and then if you go even further, it gets even more complicated because a lot of these like early colonial writings from these indigenous writers were writing specifically to shore up their family's land claims. So like Fernando Ixtlilxochitl makes a big deal about how Texcoco was dominant over another city called Huixotla very early on, which Huixotla was said, no, you weren't, and became this big. He was essentially. You have to read them not necessarily as histories, but also as kind of like legal documents to say who are making a case about like, oh no, my family owned this.
yeah. Yeah, man, history is fascinating, and I applaud you for diving into this and being able to read a lot of the source material and sorting out and kind of seeing the lay of the land. So maybe we'll be able to talk about that in and of itself in another episode. But yeah, super fascinating for myself getting into it, learning about like you said, the one of the striking things is just the abundance of evidence. But when you have all that, then it's okay. How do they overlap and contradict, and how do you kind of separate them? So it's a different quandary. It's a little bit easier with like ancient Mediterranean history where you have like Herodotus and that's it. Like I mean, okay, you have one source and that's what you're going to go on.
But I mean, even he has his biases, and that's
Yeah,
the thing.
exactly.
Like all these pre-modern writers, they all have their own biases that they're trying to push.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at least here, yeah, you have a source with a strong bias, but at least you have a couple of them. Whereas I know for a lot of other history, you're just like, yeah, we know it's biased, but it's like if we don't have this, we don't have anything to plug in otherwise. So
Yeah, and part of the advantage that classical Mediterranean history has is that it's had people poring over it for literal centuries and writing commentaries and doing everything else like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the problem with people in the United States studying Mexican history and particularly Aztec history is that there's a lot of very important sources which have just never been translated. So I don't think there's any actual English
I see.
translation of what's called the Obras Históricas, which is the major collection of Fernando Ixtlilxochitl's work, things like that. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
perhaps leading to one of the reasons why the history is underappreciated by not people who are already in the field. It's not as readily accessible. Cool. Well, with that tangent aside, I guess we can dive back into things. Super interesting, but
Yeah.
I want to get to the next couple questions. So we're still in the section which is like talking about seeking a home. So one of the major things was they're kind of ping ponging between regions, and the story goes over the reasons why they were expulsed from wherever they were at. And one of the interesting ones is the story of the Flayed Princess. So we had a lot of comments saying, like, how did they go from first stealing people's clothes off a lake to next, the next prank is at level 11. So maybe you can give us some context for this practice of a Flayed Princess.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of ties into kind of the ongoing question about like, how bloodthirsty were the Mexica? Excuse me. So it does get into this question of like how bloodthirsty were the Mexica, and honestly, the practice of flaying a skin and wearing it is not something the Mexica invented. So that practice is associated with a particular god called Xipitotec, which is usually thought to have had his origins kind of down in more kind of like southwest Mexico, in the area around like what is now like Oaxaca, Guerrero, that kind of region. And that practice kind of spread more kind of broadly throughout Mesoamerica in the period before the Aztecs showed up, and kind of what was usually sometimes called like the Epiclassic period. But yeah, it was not a foreign or brand new practice. And I should say there's another version of that story, where the ruler of Culhuacan just sees the Aztecs performing human sacrifice, and he's so offended by that he kicks them out, which is nonsense because human sacrifice is practiced all throughout Mesoamerica at this time. In fact, it's a practice that has thousands of years of history. Like if we go back to some of our early Olmec sites, which are 1500, 1200 BC, so 3,000 years earlier than this, we see evidence of human sacrifice as well, and as well as like auto sacrifice, which is people always think that the Aztecs were always so focused on sacrificing other people, but there was a lot of like what we call auto sacrifice. So a lot of important religious rituals would involve like nicking your ear to draw a little blood, or piercing your fingers, or piercing your tongue, or in more extreme, very devout cases, piercing your genitals, things like that. So yeah, so this idea about it was very shocking for the ruler of Culhuacan to see his daughter's skin being worn by a Mexica priest. Yes, that's shocking, but it would not have been a practice that he was not familiar with. It was more probably he wasn't expecting that to happen because
Yeah, as a diplomatic tool, yeah,
yeah.
not so great.
But the aspect of the Mexica that's important here is that they really and they portray themselves like this. It's the Mexica's own histories, even after its Coat's kind of burning and editing. It's they themselves saying, "Oh yeah, we did that." Yeah. And because they always come off as portraying themselves as this very driven, very pious people. And while we do see human sacrifice practice all throughout Mesoamerica, the Aztecs really kind of did turn it up to 11 to make it kind of part of this very state-focused enterprise, which it always had been. But if you look in like classic or post-classic Maya region, we see a lot of emphasis more on like capturing elite. Capturing the elites of another city. So you go out and you capture the ruler of a city and you sacrifice him, or maybe you sacrifice some other people along the way. The Mexica are the ones who really kind of turned it up to this kind of like large scale. Our religion and state is focused around this kind of, you'd almost say like a reign of terror. Of going out and capturing sacrifices. But again, the idea of that is also very often kind of misinterpreted. The vast majority of sacrifices we see are really prisoners of war, where these people might have otherwise been killed on the battlefield, but instead they're captured and taken back to Tenochtitlan and then sacrificed later. And these people would not have been unaware of what was happening to them. They were participating in a lot of the same rituals as well. Particularly when we see like states in like Tlaxcala, who was the main rival of the Aztecs. All those people in Tlaxcala were 100% familiar with all the rituals that were going on in Tenochtitlan at the time. They were doing their own sacrifices over there. In fact, part of the things that they bitch about to the Spanish when they show up is that like we can't go out and get our own sacrifices. In addition to not getting like cotton and salt, things like that. So yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in the Mexica taking previously existing practices and institutionalizing them and ramping them up and emphasizing them in a way that does not appear to have done before. And we can talk about, I think we're going to mention a little bit later, this guy called Tlacaelel, who is seen as very influential in that. But yeah, again, human sacrifice throughout Mesoamerica, well known, almost ubiquitous. It's just that the Aztecs were a little more focused on it than others for kind of both religious and political reasons.
Yeah, great. Thanks for expounding on that a little bit. And this will be a topic to be talked about in probably a whole separate video. And I'm sure there's lots of discussions on Ask Historians as well that we can plug later. But yeah, so that was some of the questions we had on seeking a home, kind of doing some comparative analysis to the stories that we see with the Mexica, comparing them to others, especially when it comes to the religious practices. But that gets us into the next section, which is finding a place, so that eventually they kind of start to settle in Tizapan and then go to Tenochtitlan. So in that last little movement there, we had some questions that popped up. One of them being that, how did Huitzilopochtli speak to the Mexica? Because a lot of the times in this narrative, they kind of end up settling, get complacent, and then Huitzilopochtli whispers in their ear to keep moving. So some of the questions were, how did Huitzilopochtli speak to the Mexica? And are there instances of him like speaking to them continuously over the years?
Yeah, so the Spanish who show up will tell you that they encountered a lot of idolatry because literally there were idols that would be kept in temples that priests would then, converse with. And these, a lot of times these, particularly with like Huitzilopochtli, only the highest levels of priests would be allowed into that, sanctum sanctorum kind of thing like that, and the idol itself would be very richly arrayed, kind of things like that. But in the very early period, you have what are called Teomama, which are god carriers. And these people are actually if you actually read some of the very early sources, a lot of the people who are actually leading the Mexica on their kind of like wandering journey are the Teomama, who are people, both men, and there's also a couple of women who are mentioned, who are tasked with literally carrying, the idol of Huitzilopochtli. And so that's how you would literally talk to your god. He'd be right there, carrying it on your back.
Okay, so it's a case of, is it a case of the spirit of the god being housed within that statue, like you're inviting it to stay in here and then you converse with it? Because I think you have some of that in like Mesopotamian history where you think, each state had its own statue of the god resided in there, and I think in certain conflicts, when a city-state takes another, they would shatter that god statue and thus get rid of it, or take the god statue back to your city and capture it. Okay,
yeah,
so
and you almost have kind of a one-to-one mapping right there. And I always tell people, like, if you're going to be comparing, Mesoamerica with some quote unquote, old world kind of, geographical and historical region, Mesopotamia is a good one because there's a lot of strange overlaps there. But don't get ancient alien on me, okay?
They both had pyramids.
But they're both very early, civilizations that are figuring things out. But yeah, so you literally have, when Mesoamerica, if you conquered a city, what you could actually do is the traditional way of marking that you had conquered a city is you set fire to their temple and you steal their idol of their god. Okay. And so Tenochtitlan actually had a whole bunch of these idols. And
oh my god, like a prison of other gods.
Yeah, pretty much. And in fact, so there is in Diego Duran's telling of it. Again, this is the very Mexica-oriented version. After the Tepanecs have been defeated, the Ecolwa, Nezahualcoyotl's group, the city of Texcoco, submits to the Mexica by letting them come in and after like a fake battle and take their god back to Tenochtitlan, take their idol of their god back to Tenochtitlan.
Wow, super interesting. Yeah, it's cool to see these historical parallels. Great, so glad we got to talk about that aspect and then the god carriers as well. There was another question in here, so kind of in finding a place, we settled on, okay, they moved to Tenochtitlan, and then eventually they do kind of put their first leader forth, Akamapichli. So maybe you can give us a real brief overview of what is this role of a Tlatoani, and did it have precedent in terms of the leadership of the tribe?
Yeah, so a Tlatoani is something you see that's really associated with something what we call an altepet, which is kind of, I usually translate it as something like a city-state or a polity. Tenochtitlan is an altepet. Azcapotzalco is an altepet. Culhuacan is an altepet. But it also kind of encompasses like the domains around that city as well. But anyway, so to actually have this city state to really be taken officially as something more than just like a random village, you need to have a Tlatoani who is a speaker, and usually it gets translated as something like king, but it is an official executive power rests in this person. And their role is really kind of to be not just the final arbiter in terms of like law, but also to be the one who is really going to be more externally focused. And we see some changing here. So in the early part of the Aztecs, this person we mentioned again before, Tlacaelel, takes this role of what's called the Siwakowat, which is kind of more of a head priest role. And kind of, it's not sure if he really reformulated it into the kind of the role that it became, or if there was historical precedence there. But what you'd have is you'd have the Tlatoani would be the one who is, again, the final arbiter. He's the official ruler, but he would often be out leading militaries, going out conquering things. And so you'd have the Siwakowat, who, this high priest who would be taking care of things at home, who'd be more in charge of domestic policy, who would often be sitting in as like the high judge when the Tlatoani isn't there. So, yeah, your Tlatoani is your kind of more external, politically focused ruler. Your Siwakowat is more your, often called like a grand vizier, but more of a kind of domestic high priest kind of ruler.
Cool. And then another thing as well see in the narrative, especially when you're talking about Azcapotzalco and Tenochtitlan, is going to be, there's always this kind of council of nobles as well accompanying the leaders.
Yeah, and in Tenochtitlan, this is usually thought of like, these four major ones, which include, the Siwakowat, but would include like, several high-level essential generals as well. And usually one of them, Tlacateco, I believe, is the one, or Tlacatecoch. Anyway, one of these high-level generals would usually be like the kind of heir apparent. And so as the Tlatoani got older, a lot of his more kind of leading militaries, aggressive things would devolve onto this person who would then, when the old ruler died, would then be in a perfect position to be, quote unquote, elected by these other, by this council to become the next Tlatoani.
Okay, so a relatively smooth way to secure the transition of power. That's cool.
Yeah, make sure your successor has a little on-the-job training.
Yeah, that's cool to see. Great. So let's keep chugging along. So the next section, as I kind of alluded to, is the relationship to the Tepanecs. So in this part in the video, we talk about they found Tenochtitlan. It starts to, they try and scrape a living together on the island. Eventually, grow powerful enough to the point where they're noticed by the neighboring Azcapotzalco Tepanecs, I believe, and are incorporated as vassals. So we had some questions here which are interesting to note, because during this part we kind of, or actually wholly on this in the video, we stay focused on the Mexica narrative. So this is a chance for us to maybe step back and, while the Mexica are vassals, reflect on the idea of like, okay, who are these other big powers in the Valley of Mexico? So can you first maybe elaborate a bit on kind of the city of Azcapotzalco, and then maybe pan out to some of the other notable city-states at the time?
Yeah, so Azcapotzalco is part of that earlier migration of Chichimec people. So the kind of more legendary part of it is that there was a Chichimec kind of, not so much almost leader, I mean definitely a leader, but almost kind of like the head of like a giant war band or group of large group of people who came into the Valley of Mexico and settled at a place called Tenayuca is usually where he's usually said to have kind of settled, which is just kind of north up along the lakeside from Azcapotzalco. And then from there he kind of divided out the regions of the Basin of Mexico among like his other Chichimec captains and sons and things like that. And so Azcapotzalco is kind of part of that early division amongst Chichimec people that just kind of happened to rise to prominence. It was very famous for its slave market, And so that's one of the things, like there were certain cities in the Valley of Mexico that became known as like certain centers of trade for certain things. So Azcapotzalco became very famous for its slave market before until the Mexica essentially raised the market and planted it over with cactus, as you do. But so it was, so Azcapotzalco really became prominent under this ruler called Tezozomoc, who was the guy who we mentioned, who is said to have lived like 120 years, things like that. But anyway, he undoubtedly had an incredibly long reign, and he kind of took Azcapotzalco from just another, one of these altepets, another city-state, to conquering really the entire, western shores of Lake Texcoco, and then moving over and actually taking the eastern shores away from the Acolwa people over there, and kind of forming almost like the template of what the Aztecs would later use. So there's the question of like, what made the Aztecs so special, and one of that is one reason for that is that they managed to get in good with the guy who laid the groundwork, the foundation that they could then build off to build a greater empire. So Tezozomoc's busy building his own empire at the time that the Aztecs are kind of wandering into the valley. But the people he's facing off against are also, in some parts, like Culhuacan, are part of this much earlier group of people. So Culhuacan traced its lineage back to the Toltecs and is seen as like the last Toltec city. And Tenochtitlan marrying into the royal family of Culhuacan is part of an important thing of having established some legitimacy. Further to the south, in kind of the Lake Xochimilco, Lake Chalco area, so these southern lakes, which were the freshest water and the best crops, things like that. I think you called it the bread basket, or the tortilla basket is what it's usually called. You have cities like Chalco, which are kind of a conglomeration of actual cities there. You have Xochimilco. Sometimes you get a city called Meshquic or Cuitlahuac as another one that gets mentioned a lot. And those last two are kind of like these kind of island cities like Tenochtitlan. So you have these very kind of independent polities down there. Further up north, where the basin kind of dries out a little bit and the lakes get a little saltier, you have places like, I think we've already mentioned it, Cuautitlan, which was just kind of up, still on the western shores, but set back. Cuautitlan means like city in the woods kind of thing like that. So it's kind of up in the woods on that northwestern area of the basin, which is an important polity there. And there's a city, again, a lake city, an island city called Xaltocan, which is pretty important in that area. But probably the most important for our talking about kind of the Mexica, aside from the Tepenacs at Azcapotzalco on the western shores, are the Culwa, or the Acolwa, actually, on the eastern shores. And again, the eastern side of Lake Texcoco is a little more brackish, and so you'll find most of these cities are actually set back from the lake, whereas on the western shores, they're kind of more set on the lake. So the eastern shores are more set back from the lake along like, rivers and streams for drainage and things like that for fresh water. The one that gets the most press is Texcoco, because that's the city that eventually become part of the Triple Alliance with the Aztecs. But really, Texcoco is now thought to have not really been the major player early on in the region. And that would usually go to a city called Cuatlichan, or Cuatlinchan sometimes, in the more modern kind of spelling of it. But Cuatlichan was, again, a city that was by these people called the Acolwa, who are, again, part of this Chichimec migration, who settled in the area. And so you have this whole kind of, regional array of powers around the lake that Azcapotzalco was busy taking over, and then the Mexica kind of inherited to build their own empire on top of.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's really cool to see I did something with a video on the rise of the Romans, where you don't really realize just how many people in different communities were spread around everywhere, and that the eventual empire that gets built is built to top all these previous networks that were already in place. A lot of inheritance being very important to this that gets missed out in history. And explains a lot of the underlying factors.
Yeah, it's almost with the Aztecs. It's like with the Aztecs in Azcapotzalco. It's almost like if you were, if there was like some sort of like Etruscan city-state that was building a big empire, kind of building all these networks and slowly building up its power base, in northern Italy, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, we're going to talk about Rome now. Rome's important now.
Mm-hmm.
Just completely eclipses it.
Yeah, so cool. We were able to touch on it a bit, and starting to talk about these kind of major powers does transition us nicely into the next section of the video, which was uprising, which is where you have Azcapotzalco, which is becomes increasingly more and more powerful, more dominant, and as it grows, some of its people under it kind of start to chafe under that rule and thinking that they have an ability to maybe shake that shackle off and then maybe even make an empire of their own. So in the video, we focus mostly on the Mexica, sort of following their narrative and their bias, saying that, they were the ones kind of leading the charge of the revolt. But actually, we had a fair amount of comments trying to get us to focus more on the other members of the Triple Alliance, notably Texcoco, which played a very important role, and then perhaps their leader, Nezahualcóyotl. So maybe you can touch on that, because that's pretty underappreciated, I would think.
Yeah, so the Triple Alliance, the way the Mexica would tell it is that they fought back against Azcapotzalco pretty much single-handedly, conquered that city, and then conquered the city of Coyoacan, where the then ruler Mashla retreated back to, and then went out and kind of forced everybody else to submit. In the more Well, let's just get one thing out of the way. So the third member of the Triple Alliance, so the three members are Tenochtitlan, which is Mexica, Texcoco, which is Acolwa, and then there's a city called Tlacopan, which is Tepenac. So it is part of the same kind of Nahua sub-ethnic group as Azcapotzalco. And the joke about Tlacopan is that no one cares about Tlacopan. I don't think there's I think there is one single book-length manuscript written on it from the 70s in French. But other than that, it gets very short shrift in all the histories, and it kind of becomes almost immediately kind of like a rump state that gets dominated a lot by the Mexica, which kind of helps them out. So Tlacopan is this city which is just further down south, still along the western coast of Lake Texcoco, from Azcapotzalco, which almost kind of towards the end, like when the Tepenacs have basically been almost defeated, decides to say, you know what, Tenochtitlan, we're on your side. Let's help you out, guys.
Reading the tea leaves a bit.
Yeah. And the way the tribute usually broke down is that, Tenochtitlan would get 2/5 of the tribute, Texcoco would get 2/5 of the tribute, and then Tlacopan would get 1/5 of the tribute. So right off the bat, it's the least important member of it. The more important one is, of course, Texcoco, which was ruled by this guy called Nezahualcóyotl, who's seen as this very, very influential figure throughout Aztec history. And so Nezahualcóyotl, his father, whose name was Ixtlilxochitl, was actually assassinated by the ruler of Azcapotzalco, Tezozomoc. So again, Tezozomoc is this guy who lived forever and started kind of his own proto-empire. A lot of ways he did that was by murder and assassination. So Tezozomoc assassinates Ixtlilxochitl, and then with the help of the Mexica, conquer that eastern shore of the basin. Ixtlilxochitl's son, Nezahualcóyotl, then goes into hiding, and it's a little confused about the timeline about where he goes and when he goes. But the important thing to keep in mind is that he's actually related by marriage to the ruling family of Tenochtitlan. So the guy who becomes ruler of Tenochtitlan, and in fact becomes the first independent ruler of Tenochtitlan, Itzcoatl, the guy who throws off the Tepenacs, is actually Nezahualcóyotl's uncle via marriage. And so Nezahualcóyotl ends up spending some time while his lands are still being ruled by the Tepenacs. He spends some time living and growing up at essentially the royal court of Tenochtitlan. And so through the Acolwa telling, the Texcoco telling of this history, he actually goes out, raises his own army, and reconquers his land, even while the Mexica are starting to fight against the Tepenacs. So in the Mexica telling, they defeat the Tepenacs, and then they grant Nezahualcóyotl his throne again. In the Texcoco telling of it, he goes out, reconquers his own land, and that kind of takes a lot of the pressure off of the Mexica, so they can then, go full strength against the Tepenacs in their own battle there. So, I mean, it's kind of that. Gets back to what are our sources and what are their biases.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, glad we got to touch on that. And a lot of people were ranting and raving about Nezahualcóyotl. Or no, maybe it's a later one. Sorry, there's a later Texcoco leader, I believe, the one who builds the dike, who was like,
No, no, that's
oh,
Nezahualcóyotl.
this the
Yeah,
same guy. Okay, very
yeah.
prolific guy. I didn't know too much about him, but people were writing all kinds of stuff in the comments, like a poet, an engineer, a great
Yeah,
politician, warrior.
he's this legendary, like he's this legendary figure who's just the is a very like he would make, if anyone who's in Hollywood is listening, this entire time period would be great. Nezahualcóyotl would be like your dream boat. He and Tlacaelel are really seen as kind of the two architects that built the Aztec state. So Nezahualcóyotl is this. He's a philosopher. He's a poet. He's a scientist. He's a he formed this great library at Texcoco. He did all these. He built and he did astrology and astronomy. He's famous for building this dike across to kind of separate eastern Lake Texcoco, which is very brackish, from western Texcoco, or western Lake Texcoco, which is more sweet water, or more palatable water, and just happens to be coincidentally where Tenochtitlan is located. So he was the one who is said to have engineered that. He is said to be very instrumental in building the aqueduct that brought fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec into Tenochtitlan. So he is this amazing figure that actually. So I think there's a book called Cantares Mexicana, which are these classic Nahuatl poems. So poems in Nahuatl from this period which have been preserved, and a guy named John Beerhorst translated him, and I think in part of his translation notes he said, like, yeah, the general de facto thing is that anytime any poem was unattributed to someone somewhere would always just attribute to Nezahualcóyotl because he was seen as that prolific and that much of a
Wow.
stereotypical poet. So it's almost like if we had another 1,000 years of history, how people always say, like, oh, well, Homer may have been like 9 or 12 guys or something like that.
Hmm.
It may have been, we'd be talking about like, Nezahualcóyotl is like 9 or 10 people, but yeah, he was a real person. There's been some pushback against him by some more recent scholars. Like there's a scholar called Jongsu Lee, who wrote a book called The Allure of Nezahualcóyotl, who really kind of pushes back a lot on the kind of the mythologizing of him. Still sees him as a very important figure, but maybe not as as legendary as things have made him out to be. But yeah, I would encourage people to read that book. It's a great academic scholarly work in kind of delving into Texcoco as well.
Yeah, and thanks again for everyone in the comments for writing these in-depth replies. It's so great. Like I learned a lot from YouTube comments, which is something you don't expect to say. But I mean, yeah, that was a real gem that I really appreciated reading about. Um, so yeah, that was the uprising. So we've covered that, and the next it's like using the basis of this proto-empire that was already, the scaffolding in place, and then finishing up the structure, and then from there using it as a springboard to create your whole empire. So this next section is going to be on the Aztec Empire. So we covered, I think, in the video a pretty good span of like its expansion over the different reigns of the rulers. And then what we can do now is there was a question here that was, what were some of the other major powers at the time? So I think what we'll do is we'll just take a look at the map that I put up towards the end of the video, which shows the extent of the Aztec Empire, and maybe what we can do is use the pockets and the borders around the empire to talk about, who was there and why did maybe perhaps the border stop there. So I think, Sean, you were planning on maybe just going around the
Yeah.
geography and just talking about the major powers.
Yeah, so if we take that map, and I think I'm looking at the same map we're talking about right now. So just to kind of the two labeled things there. So Tlaxcala is, those are the arch rivals, the boogeymen of the Mexica. So that's essentially the next valley over to the Valley of Mexico, which was its own kind of center of early polities, things like that. When we were talking about some of the major players in the early part of the basin, we didn't mention groups like Atlixco or Cholula or Huixotzinco, which are cities kind of on the border there. Tlaxcala itself was essentially, it was its own alliance of these four very closely related, very close geographic cities that formed kind of their own quadruple alliance, I guess you could say. And they, even though they officially, so in, again, per the telling of the Texcoco version of history, they actually helped Nezahualcóyotl get his throne back. But shortly after that, they very much become this early target for Mexica not really domination, because as the way like Ross Hassig, who's is a scholar on Mesoamerican warfare, Tlaxcala was always a little too big and a little too organized for the Aztecs to really just kind of conquer outright. So what you can see is, if you look at like maps of, then there's a couple maps of like the progression of the Aztec Empire over the years, you can see that they slowly just kind of get encircled. Which is a tactic that the Aztecs would use. They would encircle somebody, and then they would kind of choke off trade, choke off alliances, and then eventually just kind of take the entire thing over. So that's Tlaxcala, kind of being encircled right there. There's a big old blob down below called Teotitlan, which I would actually not like make that big, and I might put it like a little further south. Teotitlan is one of those places. It's like Tlacopan that gets mentioned a lot, but doesn't really have a whole lot of work into it. I did a little bit of a dive into it a couple years ago, and essentially it was this very sparsely populated kind of mountainous region, kind of, in like northern Oaxaca kind of area, that was more used as a bit of a crossroads. And so it wasn't really an independent polity. It was more like a place where the Aztecs kind of looked at it and said, this isn't really worth conquering. I mean, we'll do it if we have to. And then Teotitlan and Tenochtitlan kind of worked out a deal where Teotitlan would supply safe passage and maybe a little bit of porters for kind of Aztec armies passing through the area, because it was kind of a major crossroads area for them. So those are the two kind of labeled blotches. If we go up kind of north to the Gulf Coast there, kind of north along the coast, you kind of go out into kind of less settled territory. And so you start kind of running out of cities and polities to kind of really conquer. There definitely are some up there, but that's kind of what we call Huastec territory. With some, I think there's some Totonacs up there as well. So it's just these groups up there that the Aztecs weren't really looking in that direction because there were much richer prizes. If you go down a little bit to the southwest there's a little mountainous kind of divot. That's actually Metztitlan, which was kind of a place where I think it was Tizoc, one of the rulers, had a pretty good defeat. So it's essentially, it's another one of these like areas that isn't really rich enough to really be a huge target, and it's also kind of mountainous and well defended. So I think Tizoc, it was either Tizoc or Ashiakat who had a defeat there. I think Tizoc, because he essentially got his army trapped, or had ended up fighting like a battle in like a box canyon kind of thing like that. So it's this mountainous region that was kind of seen as like too difficult to conquer and not really worth it. Directly to the northwest, actually, in fact, most of that kind of border there is the region of the Tarascans, or the Purepecha, who we talked about earlier, who were their own kind of large, imperial state right there. So the Purepecha, it doesn't seem like they didn't have, necessarily the population that base that the Aztecs had, but they definitely had enough of an organized state, such that when the Aztecs and this time I'm 100% sure which ruler it was, under Ashiakat, they led an expedition into Purepecha lands to kind of conquer it, and suffered this huge defeat. It's one of those things where the Aztec army was said to be something like 25, or really, well, if we stick with the Aztec tendency to multiply things by like 4,000s or 8,000s, like 24,000 to 32,000 men went in, and like a couple hundred straggled back to Tenochtitlan, kind of thing like that. So they're a very interesting group by themselves. I would recommend actually people to go back. There was a user on AskHistorians who has now unfortunately left us, but there's another user named Ukumu who writes a lot about the Tarascans. And I did do a interview on the AskHistorians podcast, a very early one, so it's a little rough. And I think we're a little drunk, but it's a good one. It's a two-parter anyway, part of the AskHistorians podcast. It's a two-part series about the Tarascans, which is really great because there's not enough information about them, and they're very fascinating. But you can actually see on this map, you can start to see where the Aztecs are doing their kind of encirclement thing as they kind of creep up along that western coast. Moving around the map a little more, there's kind of a circular kind of divot south of where kind of Mexico City is, kind of that area. That's the Yopi land, or the Yopinka, Yopitzinco, things like that. There's a couple different names for it, but that's where the Yopi people lived. And again, that's one of those areas where, it wasn't kind of rich enough to be conquered out, to really be a huge target. It was pretty well defended. The people were seen as the Yopi were seen as very, very wild and very dangerous. So it's one of those is like, well, we'll get around to it later. But again, you can see how the Aztecs have kind of encircled the area. As we move further down the kind of the western coast, moving on to kind of the south coast there on the Pacific, you can see that this area right here, which is now like Guerrero and really Oaxaca, is where the Aztecs under Moctezuma II were really moving into. So this is a pretty rich area with a lot of like Mixtec and still some Zapotec people as well. So there are a lot of like independent polities here. There wasn't like one big state down here, but again, it was like this kind of patchwork of independent semi-aligned cities here and there. But this area is very important and was seen worth conquering because it's also a major center of like gold production as well. And then of course we have our little slice down the coast down to Xoconuchco, that again we talked about earlier. Up north of that, though, we have what is now kind of southern Veracruz and the state of Tabasco. This is a really interesting area because it's a very rich area, which is kind of an intersection point between a lot of Nahua people and a lot of Maya people as well. So there's a lot of like rich trade that's coming out of here. In fact, the province that's just kind of to the west of that, so the kind of that extension there was seen as one of the richest areas in the Aztec Empire at the time because it was this gateway of trade there. The woman who's called Malinche or Malinale, who would be the translator for Cortez and later his lover, actually came from this area, and she was a Nahua woman who is nevertheless not part of the Aztec Empire. So there's Nahua states over here. Or at least Nahua polities. There's not a whole lot of like big organized states in this region in like Tehuantepec. And again, if we head further out into kind of what's now Guatemala and the Yucatan, we get into a bunch of Maya states or Maya polities, which are not at this point really under a single dominion. The last kind of major Mayan polity was Mayapan, which was up in north of Yucatan. And even and that was kind of almost completely declined by the time the Aztecs actually even got their independence from the Tepenacs. But there's some interesting kind of glimpses about what the Mexica and the Aztecs may have been planning next had the Spanish not showed up, because there's a city on where Tabasco and the Yucatan kind of meet in that kind of corner right there, which I forget the name off the top of my head, but I'll put a note in it in the notes on this, where there were it was kind of seen as like a Aztec trading depot. And so the problem with the Aztecs is that, or the problem with having the Aztecs show up to trade with you, is that invariably you would offend or accidentally kill one of their merchants, and then they would use that as a excuse to come invade and conquer you and extract tribute. So, maybe if we hadn't, let's play a little speculative history. Maybe if we hadn't seen the Spanish show up, maybe the Aztecs would have finished up in kind of Oaxaca and then started looking a little more east to the Maya region. Interesting to think about.
Yeah, really cool stuff. And another thing, merchants might be a thing in and of itself to discuss. Often considered, I believe, like sacrosanct by the state, and then often the state using them as spies as well to look at the enemies. So really cool stuff. So let's see. The next section here is kind of similar now that we've kind of covered the breadth of the Aztec history. That last portion we talked about was the other major powers, and the next couple sections are going to be diving into kind of some of the nitty gritty that can fill in this time period. So like, for instance, one of the questions we had is, do you have a favorite Aztec ruler? That being aimed at yourself, Sean. And I think you've noted that you do.
So I really like this guy called Ahuizot, who's the second to last Aztec ruler. First of all, his actual name glyph is this mythological creature called an Ahuizot, which is
is that the water beast?
That's the water beast, which is said to like lurk in the waters of Lake Texcoco, and then its tail has a human hand, and it would wave the hand up to make it look like somebody's drowning, and then somebody would try to save it, and it would drag you under and then eat your eyeballs, your teeth, and your fingernails. So that's just kind of cool just in general. But I think he's an interesting character because his successor, Moctezuma II, who's the one that the Spanish encountered, under Moctezuma II, you see this really solidification of kind of the Aztec social structure. So Moctezuma is famous for kind of making sure that all the servants in his palace were sons and daughters of nobility. He was the one who said, you can't look directly at me, nobody touches me, I'm semi-divine, kind of things like that. So we see this kind of breaking away from a more egalitarian past of the Aztecs. It used to be that you could go up through the Aztec ranks as a commoner and become what's called like a Qualpapilton, or a Qualpapil, or a Qualpili. I guess I should actually say the correct word. Which is kind of an eagle noble, so you kind of a life peerage, so you could earn yourself kind of a place in the nobility, even if it wasn't passed on to your children. And that kind of gets faded out even early on, but it's really under Moctezuma, who ruled for a lot longer than most people think. I think it was like 18, 20 years, something like that. So he had a lot of time to shape society. So Ahuizot comes along this time where there's still a lot of almost a lot more kind of just, he had a common touch, I guess you could say. So he's seen as this very energetic, very personable ruler who comes along right after the rule of this guy named Tizoc, who is this complete waste of space, who ruled for something like 5 years and then never really won any good battles and was...
I kind of laugh too because his glyph looks like an arrow to the knee, like it's just
Yeah.
a total fail.
Well, his name means like, the pierced one, so it goes back to this auto-sacrifice thing. But yeah, I don't think he took an arrow to the knee so much as I think he was, it varies from legend to legend, but he was, by most sources, probably assassinated or poisoned by the Aztec Mexica nobility. So
After several military failures, right?
Yeah, so the idea is that to be a Tlatoani of the Aztecs, you got to go out and you got to be constantly winning battles. That's how you get your authority. And he kind of went out and did like there's something called a coronation campaign. So once you've been elected ruler, you go out and you lead a military campaign to bring back captives that you can then sacrifice during your actual coronation ceremony. And he brought back like 30 guys and lost like several hundred troops, and he was like, that's good enough for me. And everyone else is like, oh, maybe not. So Ahuizot gets elected, and as part of his coronation, like, all these people in the area, like Tlaxcala and Cholula, all these like kind of rival cities and states, elect just not to attend his coronation as this big kind of FU, to be like, you're not important anymore, guys. We've seen what kind of failure you've had on the throne for a while. And so Ahuizot then goes out and does this enormous blitz of conquering things. He's actually the one that, that area we were talking about down, further down south, Xoconuchco. He's the one who's responsible for that. He does this huge, expansion of territory. And then he holds kind of like it's not really a second coronation campaign. It is officially the dedication of the, newly rebuilt temple to Huitzilopochtli. But he's the one who we get the story about the, 80,400 sacrifices, in a day for the dedication of that temple. So he is this big, huge, bombastic figure who takes rule pretty young, and then ends up dying pretty young as well. Apparently he's either grievously injured or becomes sick while building a second canal into Tenochtitlan, which then causes flooding. It's probably just more like seasonal flooding, but yeah, he's an interesting character who kind of brings a lot of verve and vigor back to the Aztecs just when they really needed it.
Okay, cool. And that segues us into kind of the next question that someone had is like, what are some of the other important figures of the era? So we talked on one of your favorites. And then we've also touched on Nezahualcóyotl and then Tlacaelel. So maybe you can touch real briefly on some of these other figures that are notable.
Yeah, so just to kind of briefly touch on Tlacaelel again, so he was actually the brother to the first Moctezuma and Chimalpopoca, who was the ruler that the Tepenex assassinated. So he's like right there in the mix of things. And what you see, like at every time there's a new time to elect a new Aztec or new Mexica ruler, people are always like, well, what about Tlacaelel? And he's like, no, I'd rather not. So he's the one who had that kind of Grand Vizier position as the Cihuacoatl. And he's the one who we really see as shaping this idea. He's the one who's on the books as saying, you know what, let's go out and let's have a system where we go out and we conquer other places, but we also bring back a lot of captives to, quote, feed Huitzilopochtli. So he's the one who we really kind of ascribe a lot of like this Aztec blending of religion and politics and warfare together. So he's a fascinating character. There's a book by Susan Schroeder about him, whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head, but again, I will put it in the notes, which kind of summarizes his life in a really interesting way. The other guy I want to talk about is actually one of the losers of Mexica history, and that's this guy called Moquihuish. So as I'm sure everybody knows, the Mexica had two cities. There was Tenochtitlan, which gets all the press, and then there was their sister city, Tlatelolco, which was independent up until about 1472, 1473. Moquihuish was this guy who kind of came up through the ranks, married well, was a famous warrior, great war leader, and eventually became elected to rulership of Tlatelolco, which again is independent, but they're like literally Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco are like on the same island. I would encourage people to go look at your video about Tenochtitlan, which is really good. And if you see kind of a weird oblong side piece to what looks like the main island of Tenochtitlan, that's Tlatelolco. Very famous market, huge rich town, but definitely kind of behind the Mexica or of Tenochtitlan when it comes to kind of political dominance. So depending on which version you want to believe, Moquihuish either came up with a plan to overthrow his brothers in Tenochtitlan, or Tenochtitlan got a little jealous of how rich Tlatelolco was without, going out and doing all the heavy lifting and bring back tribute. But the end result is that there's a civil war between these two cities, which ends up with Moquihuish, according to one tale, being killed in single combat atop the temple, the main temple of Tlatelolco by Ashiakat. So he's a very dramatic, interesting figure as well that nobody ever hears about.
Yeah, and I'm sure in the comments, again, if people have more individuals that they want to speak about, post them in the comments below. Like I said, this is how I found out about a lot of the exploits of the others. So definitely encouraging people to chip in as well. So let's see. we had another question in here that was like, hey, can you give us a brief crash course on the conquest by the Spanish? So we're going to table most of this discussion for now, but I think you wanted to plug a book.
Yeah, I would, if anybody wants a pretty concise overview, which is also a very insightful overview of essentially the Spanish and the Aztecs clashing, I would recommend Ross Hassig's book, Mexico and the Spanish Conquest.
And as a YouTuber, I would recommend Kings and Generals. They've also got their own videos that they've been putting up on various peoples of Mesoamerica, and I do believe they have one on the Spanish conquest as well, or at least the siege of Tenochtitlan. So you can get a bit of that in video form as well. Or, as always, head on over to Ask Historians. I'm sure there's a variety of posts there.
Yeah, where I and many others have written many, many words on this.
Yeah. We have another question here, which is, what remains of the Aztec Empire today? So I think you were going to touch briefly on people, places, and maybe things.
Okay, so the easiest way to look at this is that if you look at Mexico City, Ciudad de Mexico, the DFA, that's just Tenochtitlan. So I mean, the actual core of the city itself is, the Zocalo is the old sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan. So a lot of the city was pretty much destroyed during, literally torn down as part of the tactics of the Spanish, but it was rebuilt because it was too important to let go. And if you look around, because Mexico City now it's huge. It covers the entire basin of Mexico almost. So if you look around, you'll see all these neighborhoods in Mexico City, which used to just be independent polities. That's why, we were talking about like the location of Tizapan. It's like there's a Tizapan right now, but there's also the, historical Tizapan, which is by the neighborhood of Culhuacan, which is next to the Cerro de Estrella, which is the sacred hill where the Aztecs used to ring in, what they call the new fire ceremony. So to mark kind of the passage of 52 years, which is the entirety time it takes for the two calendars to go around in one big cycle. So, Mexico City is essentially just a giant, like Rome, it is a giant historical archaeological site. And every time they build a new subway line, they find new stuff. So, But then there's some other things all throughout. So a lot of the reason you have, for instance, like Nahuatl names in places like Guatemala, is because the Spanish, once they took over rule, they essentially just continued the Aztec conquest of Mesoamerica. So they would go out, and you see all these, like particularly in like the early conquistador accounts, where they would say, "Oh yeah, I gathered up like myself and like 15 horsemen and like 100 footmen and 30 crossbowmen, and then a bunch of natives as well." And those natives usually outnumber the Spanish like 10 to 1 at the minimum. And so you have all these places where essentially the Aztec and Spanish went out and conquered them together, and then sometimes they resettled there, and sometimes they renamed it and things like that. And essentially, for a while, Nahuatl was like an official governmental language in the early colonial period. So you'll find a lot of like Nahuatl legal documents as well. The other kind of aspect is that up in kind of northern Mexico, even places like Chihuahua, things like that, or in like San Luis Potosi, you'll find a lot of people who can trace their descent back to the Aztecs and more central Mexican people, because a lot of those people, when silver was discovered up there, a lot of the people who were well oriented to go migrate up there and take advantage of that were Nahuatl elites, and particularly Spanish men who had married into Nahuatl elite families. There's a book called Moctezuma's Children, which tells about Leonor Moctezuma, who is a descendant of Moctezuma II, who was married to a Spaniard who ended up being one of the major founders of like the silver mines up in northern Mexico. And also up there, you also had during the early colonial period, you had a push by the Spanish authorities to have people from Tlaxcala, who were seen as very loyal subjects, to move up into that area to help civilize it, because they were having a lot of problems with the Chichimex people up there rebelling.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. Again, a lot of this is stuff that we can't get into too much now. We're just alluding to books and resources. But yeah, I'm thankful that you're able to at least point people in a certain direction, give them a taste of it. Same thing is going to apply to a lot of these other comments. I've kind of grouped them into blocks where hopefully we'll just try and whiz through these and point people in the right direction. The prime example is going to be warfare. We got a lot of questions on, what was the nature of Aztec warfare, specifics on organization, what's the path to becoming a jaguar warrior, fighting techniques, lots of stuff. I will say that we're probably going to try and develop a video itself covering different aspects of Aztec warfare, maybe on the organization, tactics, maybe even supplies and logistics. We'll see. There'll be some format of it for now. But if people do want to dive into it, I would recommend the Osprey books are always good, high level with illustrations. But then also there's the Ross Hassig book, I believe, as well.
Yeah,
just
which
Aztec
is
warfare.
literally called Aztec Warfare. Yeah, he literally wrote the book on it.
So those are the resources we'll direct you to. But then maybe yourself, Sean, you can give us a brief overview of like the nature of it.
Yeah, so I mean, people, there's this kind of misconception that it was like this highly ritualized kind of, you're fighting only to take captives, not to actually kill. Which I mean, that is one aspect, but it's one aspect which was kind of compartmentalized away from regular warfare. So there's these things called the Flower Wars, or Shoshi Yaoyot, which were these kind of like very ritualized, kind of agreed upon combats between city-states, where essentially the elites would go out and they'd fight more to take captives than anything else. There's a lot of talk by Hassig and by another guy named Isaac, who I think I can link something, a paper of his, which talk about how this is really just kind of warfare by another means. So warfare is very dependent on the cycle of seasons. So when you have these massive armies that could be mustered up, because every man through the universal education of the Aztecs would get some training in the army, and so you could muster up these giant, tens, 20s, thousands of people to kind of go out and fight battles. And particularly because the way the neighborhood systems, the neighborhoods were kalpuli, and so you could have these neighborhood schools which had senior veterans in them, which could then call up, groups from there, and that would kind of form your kind of command structure from like the neighborhood up until you get to kind of more abstract groups. So you can muster up all these people, but they had to go back home to help plant crops and bring in the harvest and all that. So having elites who weren't tied to the agricultural system, who could then keep the war going, was a way of kind of grinding down your enemy, particularly when you're the Aztecs, and you can just you have this huge amount of resources you can throw at people. As for like the nature of warfare itself, I mean, what we can see, we don't have like an Aztec battle manual, but we do have from kind of the way just that their armies were set up and the weapons they used and reports from the Spanish about what they encountered. What we would see is that we typically see like this initial barrage of arrows and sling stones, which again, kind of puts to bed the idea that the Aztecs were just going out to capture people, because it's very hard to capture somebody when you're firing arrows at them. It's not really conducive to that. But after that initial barrage, you would then have kind of the what Hassig calls the shock warriors. These are your people who are wielding the maquawits, the obsidian club swords. These are your jaguar warriors, your eagle warriors, your shorn ones, your otomi warriors, who would go forth, kind of charge forward, throwing ot darts to kind of break up the line as they go forward. And then you would have kind of a more kind of general melee where you would have essentially you would have a kind of a knot of like your elite shock warrior kind of backed up by more junior people or more common people who are wielding these kind of long slashing spears. And so your shock warrior would be trying to kind of break the line and kind of get somebody down so that they could take them captive, and then that captive would kind of be shuffled to the back by these kind of supporting soldiers. So that's kind of the general idea about how it would work. So there was definitely a system to it, and there's a whole thing about like signaling through smoke and through horns and through drums and things like that. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and as I was reading about it, my wheelhouse is mostly going to be classical antiquity, looking at different armies. If you're familiar with that, you have these different empires that organize themselves and are able to get warfare down to a bit of a science, where you have these technical manuals, and then you have different kind of arms of the military that rise and fall and get more important. So like Macedonian phalanxes built around this specific weapon and formation and drill and practice, or the Greek phalanx. And then you also have the ability to rope into your tactics, having to respond to the presence of perhaps cavalry or elephants or chariots. There's a lot of different dynamics, which kind of spurs on the way we see warfare in the past. Whereas with the Aztecs, it's a little bit different. The combat is without horses, without really chariots. So it's very much the foot soldier centric. So you could maybe compare it a bit more to what you see with like the Germanic tribes, which is mostly like war bands that form up around notable warriors and I guess clans, but here it's maybe a bit more organized than that, around the Kabuli, like you're saying. But then the combat itself does not devolve into just this people running around everywhere. They did know about formations, they knew about proper communication, line of battle was important, holding formation, when to throw in reserves, ambushes were known to them, all sorts of stuff like that. So there aren't direct parallels to like classical history, like I say, with the different units and formations and those X factors.
Yeah. So one of the things, so I did, when I was running the Ask Historians podcast, I did a great episode that I think I should check out with a user there called Iphicrates, who's Dr. Roel Koenig. Yeah, I think he actually helped you out on one of
Sparta one.
Yeah, he's a amazing guy who I could listen to talk all day. And I don't think it ended up making it necessarily into the podcast itself, but we talked a lot about how when we talk about archaic Greek warfare, where you have these kind of like, you have your heavily armored elite, and then everybody else kind of knots around them. It sounded very familiar to me when I was hearing him talk about things like that. So there are some interesting parallels, but of course, you take cavalry completely out of the question, it gets a little unusual. But even when the Spanish show up, you start to see how flexible the system was, because you could start to see the Aztecs adapt almost immediately to the introduction of things like guns, cannons, and additionally cavalry, where they start to have things like more open formations, or start to use start to spread pick battlefields which are bad for cavalry, or using breastworks or like longer spears as kind of proto pikes, things like that. It's very interesting.
Yeah, cool. So like I said, we'll have to do follow-up episodes on this, and maybe even invite Iphicrates back for another discussion. That'd be cool to just freeform it and have have talks. But we'll see. So yeah, that's it for warfare. A bit of a teaser there, but at least again we've pointed you in the right direction, and we'll hopefully be coming back with more content on that. Next topic was kind of a bucket on daily life. Very similar response here from us in the sense that there's a lot of resources. You can check it out.
Huge.
We'll be doing videos on it in the future. I mean, it was pretty open-ended. Isaac Sanchez, for instance, says, can you ask about an average Aztec person's daily life, rituals, relationships, economics?
I mean, what's an average Aztec person? It's a big place. I would point people towards something like Carrasco's Daily Life of the Aztecs or Aguilar-Moreno's Handbook to Daily Life in the Aztec World. Both excellent things that talk about a lot of the kind of
Yeah,
nuances there.
that's the one I've been using a lot of, the Handbook to Life in the Aztec World.
Yeah.
Really great, super thick. Let me flip through it. I have it open in front of me. It is like 400 plus pages. It
Yeah,
has sections that cover everything. It's great.
it's a wonderful resource for especially when you're getting into it. But But I mean, there was daily rituals people would do. I mean, there's a whole section of academic study about like daily what we call household rituals, and so we can see like little household statuettes and things like that in Aztec, like home sites that we don't really see kind of necessarily mirrored in like the big, state rituals that we see kind of. That we focus on mostly in historical things, but and there's a whole bunch of like superstitions and calendar stuff and like games and things. I don't know. So I think we're doing an episode about like growing up Aztec kind of thing like that, and it talks a lot about like schooling and how to raise a child. I think we were talking about doing one of those in the future, which cover a lot of these. But I mean, yeah, it's hard to say like what an average Aztec person would do because it would kind of depend on their status in society. I'll send you a link to a paper by this guy named Hicks, who talked about kind of the some of the class divisions in Aztec society. So you have like your hyper royal ruling family, the Tlacaelel, the lords. Then you have the Pipiltin, who are the nobles beneath that, and then you have this big mass of people called the Massahualtin, who are the commoners. And below that, you can have like people who are kind of like serfs, which only nobles owned private land. Everything else was kind of held in common by the Capuli. But so you had like serfs on noble held land who would be tied to that land. But then you also had slaves who could be used by people, but they were not slaves like, how most Americans think of slaves, or slaves like how slaves were used throughout the rest of like, the ancient world and like Rome and things like that, where it wasn't like a hereditary thing. So, yeah, hard to say, but hopefully we'll cover that in some future episodes.
Yeah, and thanks again for the people who asked. Potato Gabe also had, I think, another question here asking about different large population centers around Mesoamerica. We talked about some of them when we were talking about, who are the other principal powers. But I think here you listed maybe a couple we can throw out there.
Yeah, so I would say just so in kind of the area of it, when we're talking about like this time period of like all these massive migrations, which is sometimes called like the Epiclassic, as I think I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of like regional power centers, places like Xochicalco or Cholula, which is the city that's been settled for an enormously long amount of time and has the Great Pyramid of Cholula, which is by mass the largest pyramid in the world, and also has been like consistently used as like a holy site for 1,500 years or something like that, something ridiculous. When people are always like, do you know Oxford University is older than the Aztecs? I like to point out, like, do you know that the Great Pyramid of Cholula has been used as a holy site for longer than France? So, but anyway, yeah, because there's a church there right now that's still used for I was going to say rituals, but yeah, church stuff, Catholic church stuff. But you have like El Tajín over on the Gulf Coast. And so you have this kind of proliferation of things that aren't like the mega cities like Tenochtitlan, but are pretty substantial settlements. If you look into like particularly the classic Maya and the pre-classic Maya, you can find cities like Caminalju, which, or Palenque or Tikal, which are, tens of thousands of people strong, which are these pretty huge sites. The Maya region is pretty interesting because it was like really densely populated. And we're really still learning how densely populated it was. So you'd have like, you might say like, well, they didn't have a city of like 250,000 people, like Tenochtitlan, but they would have like a city of like 80,000, and then like, 8 kilometers down the river, you'd have another city of like 80,000, right next door, and they might not like each other. So, which is kind of interesting. In the basin of Mexico itself, the big one that comes before Tenochtitlan is of course Teotihuacan, which is in a valley kind of off to the northwest, kind of a spur valley off the basin there, which got up to like most people say it's over 100,000 to like 150,000, thing like that. The interesting thing about Teotihuacan is that it seems to have been like sucked up all the population in the basin. And so there's been some studies, and I'll link to one of the books that talks about this, where it's not till after Teotihuacan falls that you see almost like a dispersal of the population from that. But at the time, when it was at its height, like there's no like in the valley itself, there's not really any kind of rival city. Very interesting.
That is really cool. Sweet. Yeah, so that was all portion of daily life. A lot more questions that I wasn't even able to field here, but again, this gets you started. Another chunk of questions here were on trade. We have Milo here who asks, how connected were the economies of pre-Columbian America? Did the Aztecs trade with the Incas? So asking, I guess, do we have any evidence of coins or goods that we know link disparate parts of the empire?
Well, no coins because they didn't use coins. We don't have any evidence of direct trade between the Incas and the Aztecs. Like the Aztecs, the Incas were pretty new on the scene down in South America. But it's kind of looking at trade in between Mesoamerica and the Andean region, we don't really see a whole lot of direct connections. There's some idea about like emeralds or precious stones that may have come up from like Colombia and things like that, and maybe kind of like Ecuador and those kind of regions that may have filtered their way up through Central America up into Mesoamerica. And there's a pretty strong argument that actual metallurgy in Western Mesoamerica was the center for metallurgy there, had its origins as coming up from kind of the Peruvian Ecuadorian coast, several centuries before the Aztecs, of course. But again, we don't really have any direct evidence of links between them. Really, as you see trade go further down into Central America, by the time you're getting kind of, to Honduras and then down into like Nicaragua and then into Costa Rica, you're not really seeing any direct connections with the Aztecs down there. We do have things like, we have some reports in this thing called the Annals of the Chakchiquels, which is a post-colonial collection. It's a post-colonial book, but it records the history year by year of this group in the Guatemalan highlands that has like a mention that sounds like of like Aztec traders coming down in that region, and we definitely have very, very strong evidence of like canoe trade all the way around the Yucatan Peninsula going down into the Honduran coast. Like Columbus on, I think, his third voyage or something like that, actually encountered what sounds like Maya traders on the coast of Honduras, things like that. But it seems like it kind of peters out, at least as far as direct trade goes down that way. We have a lot more direct evidence of trade going to the northwest, but not really strongly during the Aztec period. If we look in the kind of more classical and epiclassical periods, so again this time period of a lot of like shifting and things like that that preceded the Aztecs, we actually see some very direct links of trade going from central Mexico, Mesoamerica, up into what is now the American Southwest. And so we can find things like tropical birds up in like New Mexico, and evidence of like chocolate and rubber and things like that. And for a long time, it was thought that all the turquoise that was in Mesoamerica actually came down from the Southwest as well. Though there's been basically some re-examination that shows that probably isn't true. But we definitely have some interesting links that go kind of along the mountainous spine of Western Mexico up into the American Southwest. Eric Wolf, a guy who became a famous anthropologist for other reasons, he actually did a lot of writing, like in his very early, grad student days, essentially about Mesoamerican history. And he had this one phrase that has stuck with me the entire time, is that, and it was a pretty popular idea, that the Mexica originally got their connection to the settled people of central Mexico and the Valley of Mexico by being mercenaries who would escort trade caravans up and down that western spine there. So the Aztecs may have been, Eric Wolf's, Aztec mercenaries. May have been, the kind of their origin, which is a little fanciful and probably not how it worked, but it's fun to think about.
That is really interesting. And actually, as we talk more about trade here between all these different parts of, I guess, Mesoamerica and beyond, there was a follow-up question here by, let me read out the name. It's kind of funny. It's alt-centrist, neo-Buddhist, anarcho-Bonapartist.
Ooh.
So this user
basically
asks...
I would love to read their manifesto.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, yeah, very... Anyways, I don't want to get into it. But his specific question says, how would Aztec trade outside the vassals they ruled over work? So basically, I think you laid out, okay, here's the reach of it. But then if we look at, okay, let's assume that this connection existed. Maybe how does it actually work?
Yeah.
So was there like a merchant class, or was it state run, or were they just okay?
So we actually have a kind of a almost like the Aztecs weren't necessarily like a caste system, but it was kind of that thing where, like, you would inherit the profession of your father, thing like that. So we have kind of a generational kind of class of long distance merchants who would go out and do these like very long distance trading, kind of, disappear for months or years at a time to kind of go out and then come back with like very high quality goods. Like I was talking about, in the Maya region where you see this kind of like intrapo of Aztec traders showing up, that's these people, who are these long distance traders who are showing up in that region. And they're the ones who people would always look at and be like, are you guys here to actually trade, or are you spies? And the answer is, of course, both. When Ahuizot went down and conquered that far down Xoconochco area, it was because a bunch of long distance traders had been attacked down in that region. And so these people would, have they had their own patron god, they had their own rituals. We should definitely do an episode on that one coming up. But there's also a whole system of more localized in trade. So again, you have certain areas in the Valley of Mexico which are known for certain things. Like this city might be known for, being the best market for dogs. This city might be known as the best one for feathers. This one might be the best for cotton, things like that. And the market at Tlatelolco, which Cortez said was bigger than the city of Seville. Or maybe it was bigger than Cordoba. Anyway, it was, the market itself was bigger than, a Spanish city, was the main market. And the Aztec kind of system of marketeering was that every 5 days you would have a market day. So every 5 days you'd have this kind of like people coming in from the outskirts to their local markets, and then people who were kind of connections between local markets and larger markets, and then all kind of going back to this centralized, major market in Tenochtitlan, Tlatelolco. And that is all separate from the tribute system, which was essentially on a schedule. The rulers of a particular conquered city would have to send, either like every 80 days or twice a year or once a year would have to send a set amount of tribute goods. And there were people called Calpishke, who are sometimes translated as stewards, but basically kind of like tax collectors, who would ensure that kind of made its way back to Tenochtitlan.
Sweet. And as we're going along with all this, like you stated before and corrected me again, no form of like strict coinage being used, so a lot of bartering, but there was a form of currency, I guess, in place, maybe not coinage, but otherwise. So one of the questions from Daniel Anderson was wanting me to ask you about Aztec chocolate currency and maybe other forms of currency.
Yeah, so there wasn't necessarily, a coinage, but there was kind of standardized exchange rates for things. And the most popular, most well-known one is for cacao beans. So I forget what the actual exchange rate was, but you could have like 3 cacao beans would get you like a tamale or something like that. Because you could get sacks of 80,000 of them, something like that, or sacks of 8,000 of them. So that's a pretty well-known standard currencies, just cacao beans. And there was actually like a whole industry of like counterfeiting them as well. And you would have people in the markets who would be kind of like stewards of the markets, who would actually enforce like the rules and laws and make sure trading was done fairly. Who, if they caught you with counterfeit cacao beans, you could be executed.
Wow.
Yeah. But some of the other standard things is that so the next step up from like a single cacao bean would be a manta or like a cotton cloak, and you could have those have like kind of standard exchange rates for those depending on like the quality of them. And then you could also have like goose quills that would be filled with gold dust, as kind of that's like your most direct kind of proto currency, because it's gold, right? So it's melt that down and there you go, you've got a coin. So there's some things that we know that were pretty much very standard exchange rates in the markets. So you wouldn't necessarily go in and have to bring like an entire wagon full of ducks and figure out what you could trade for them, kind of thing like that.
I see. Yeah, super interesting stuff. So again, God, all of this wants me to spend the next year doing episodes on each and every bit, but that's the point of the podcast, stuff like this, is just lay it all out in one video. So interesting. So again, thank you, Daniel, for asking about that. Next little bucket of questions was about law. Again, we're going to have to speed through this because we're getting on with time. But James Monroe asks, what were their legal institutions like? He goes on to ask us to compare it to Europe, which may be a bit much, but maybe you can give us an outline on the concept of law and maybe what institutions they had.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I like the fact that James Monroe is asking this question.
Right.
Yeah. Secondly, I mean, the problem with saying like, how does it compare to Europe is that I'm not a scholar of contemporary, late medieval, early modern Europe, and also, it's kind of a fallacy to be like, let's compare America to Europe, because Europe was not a united place at this time, and the Americas and not even Mesoamerica were a united place at this time. But so now that I've taken a dump all of your question, I mean, we do have a system of organized laws and courts throughout the Aztecs. A lot of these actually get ascribed to our good old buddy Nezahualcóyotl. And there's a book by Offner, I think it's Laws and Institutions of Texcoco or something like that. I'll link it to it, where he talks about it in depth. But Texcoco is seen as the one, and again, this has been challenged in more recent scholarship, but Texcoco is the one that's seen as kind of bringing the laws and bringing the legal institutions to the more wild, Mexica. But there was kind of a system of kind of neighborhood courts, and market courts. So the market would have its own court, and then you could have kind of an appeals court above that, and then above that you would go to kind of like a royal court, and that's when you would have essentially like the Siwakowat, the Grand Vizier sitting in to hear those things. And if you were like a noble, you couldn't be tried in any of these like commoner courts. You would go directly up to these higher courts, things like that. So yeah, we did have a system of essentially courts and laws and a legal system.
And punishment-wise, is it, are there ideas of like an eye for an eye, like proportional, like if you do a crime?
Yeah, there is kind of an idea of like, if you steal something, you pay it back and then some, if you injure someone, then, you have to either give them restitution. I'm not sure if there's a necessary like eye for eye kind of thing, but it is kind of like a system, because like most pre-modern people, they're not really looking to like throw you in jail for a while. It's kind of more of a direct kind of thing like, okay, well, you broke this, you owe this in exchange, or you need to, one of the punishments could be basically like, or you become this person's slave, until you work off your debt, kind of thing like that. There were some kind of system of like prisons, essentially they were like wooden cages to keep people in, who they thought might be like flight risks or who might be facing things like execution. So you would, put people in cages until you get them before a judge, and then the judge might order them executed, which was usually done by kind of a club to the head. So there is that as well. But yeah,
and the system of like courts, would that also be like distributed on the neighborhood level? Like if there's a crime in the neighborhood, it's kind of dealt with the neighborhood leadership.
Yeah, so you have kind of like your almost like local associations of people who are, and again, this is all done on like the Calpulli system, so that your neighborhood system. So you would have people in the Calpulli who were usually associated with a Telpashkali, which is like the neighborhood school / temple / community center, would really be responsible for kind of like keeping peace and act as kind of like a proto police force, things like that. So.
Okay, so lots of institutions at the local level, and then in certain places where the government gets involved, they might have like, it goes to the higher court system or administrators who can enact punishment, etc.
Yeah, and again, if you're an elite, you don't have to deal with these commoners. You go straight to your other elites who are going to judge you 100% fairly.
But is there really any codification of the laws in any sense, or at least
So
maybe certain laws?
with Moctezuma the First, Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, he is very famous for laying out like a kind of a series. He's known as kind of a lawgiver, where he lays out like a series of like 12 laws, and they're very broad, and they can in some sense. So he lays out some sumptuary laws, like, these are the people who are allowed to wear sandals, and these are the people who are allowed to, who are allowed to wear cotton clothes. But he also lays out things like, if you commit adultery, that can be punished by death, and some other things like that.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. And then also, like, when we're talking about no real exact writing system, it's hard to codify all the laws as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've touched on law. And then the last kind of bucket of questions here were about kind of like, again, touching back on the whole idea of the initial episode, which is like misunderstood moments in history or the way the Aztecs are portrayed today. So this bucket is kind of like film and other questions. So we'll break it up into kind of two main ones. The first is going to be touching on Apocalypto, and then after that we'll pivot to like kind of grouping all the questions together under what Ruben, one of the users, said, which is more about like Aztecs being depicted as incredibly brutal and emphasizing sacrifice. And we'll maybe use that as a way to maybe touch on that topic and close out kind of the perception of the Aztecs. But we'll start first with Tom Rosario here's question, who asks about how much artistic freedom did Mel Gibson use in Apocalypto?
So Apocalypto, notably filmed in Yucatec, doesn't have anything to do with the Aztecs, at least not, per the story wise. So Mel Gibson was ostensibly trying to portray like a late post-classic Maya group, and from kind of the setting, it looks kind of like somewhat Yucatanish, and the fact that he filmed the thing in Yucatec kind of puts that. But there's a couple different things about the ways you can go about this. One is to take the really nerdy view, and he's been criticized. He did have an actual Mayanist archaeologist who kind of helped out on like set design and costume design, and like a lot of the costuming is like really spot on about how like elaborate and just fantastical these elites would get with like labrae piercings and body paint and these huge headdresses and these pectorals and things like that. It's very that's pretty great. He has been criticized for the fact that he kind of like mishmashes together a couple different centuries of Mayan of Maya like architecture, but I mean, very like there's like 5 people on the planet who notice that, so I'll give him a slide on that. The problem that he does is that he kind of gets society completely wrong, and I have like a couple different answers I've written about this on Ask Historians, but he really messes up in trying to portray, because he's not trying to portray a society, an actual functioning society. Mel Gibson was trying to do an allegory, and in my opinion, it's a really racist, colonial, apologetic allegory. Where it's this dysfunctional, bloodthirsty, savage society, which is only kind of redeemed when the Spanish float up on their boat carrying a cross. So I have a lot of problems with it, kind of like from that metatextual thing. But even a lot of the kind of more particulars he gets wrong, like the one thing that he always gets, that the movie gets mocked for, is that the simple village that we see in the beginning where our protagonist is from, like it does not make sense. It it shows like a hunter-gatherer people in the woods, and at this point, we're talking again, as we were talking about, like this is an incredibly heavily settled and agricultural society. Like it'd be as if I wanted to set something in medieval Europe, and I opened, in the 15th century, and I opened on a bunch of Germanic dudes in woad paint, who were, living off, wild goats or something like that. It just it doesn't make sense at all from the actual, way that society was set up at the time. He gets a lot of the sacrifice wrong as well, in the sense that he does portray it as like this weird, bloodthirsty, sadistic ritual, as opposed to this religious, still kind of an ecstatic ritual in the fact that it's very, it's very kind of transcendent. But it's also not something that was necessarily done sadistically or in this like weird, savage, techno rave sense that he seems to portray. And then like the fields of dead bodies is just completely wrong for even like the Aztecs. So yeah, some of the artistic design pretty great. The actual plotting of the movie is a pretty good chase movie. Um, Everything else around it though is kind of like I would say not just like wrong, but like seriously like pretty offensive from the standpoint of like making a movie that to me strikes as like an apology and even justification for colonialism and all that came after it.
Hmm. And that kind of leads us on to, I guess, Ruben's comment, which we'll use to kind of close here, where he says, we see a lot in media and films, etc., that the Aztecs are depicted as incredibly brutal and very sacrificial. Just how much truth is there to that? Or is it largely propaganda of Western colonizers to justify wars, looting, and slavery? So it's kind of what you're talking about, that, but it's kind of the main principle, and what we saw in the YouTube comments as well is that whenever you look at Mesoamerica, particularly the Aztecs, it ends up being the lightning rod for the discussion, which is always talking about sacrifice, and it's the most sensational bit, and especially when Western focused and European focused like educational curricula goes to the Aztecs. You don't have that much time, and then when you do touch it, you're going to go straight to that lightning rod. So usually that's the way people are introduced, and there's no denying that it's a part of it, but unfortunately it does kind of eclipse the rest of the discussion, and people get caught up on that. So I guess the response here would be, maybe we can touch on, was it as brutal as is depicted, and then maybe, say that, okay, even if, let's say it does meet whatever level of brutality, if everyone gets it correct, then we can pivot and say, but you're missing out on all these other parts. So maybe we can start first with the accuracy of it, just real briefly, because this is, I know, a subject you could do an entire video on.
Multiple.
So we'll start real briefly on that.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we end up, the history we get is always focused on this very top level elite history. So when we're learning about the Aztecs, even when we get beyond like actual Spanish sources into like, the, indigenous and mestizo sources themselves, we're learning a lot about very elite people and very elite men whose main preoccupation was essentially politics and warfare. And, at that time, politics was warfare and warfare was politics, and everything was really bound up in religion. And so, again, when we talk about Tlacaelel creating this kind of system wherein, religion and warfare are really intrinsically tied together into kind of this system where you go out and you conquer things, and part of the reason you conquer things is to get captives, and then that feeds back into kind of establishing your dominance over the people because you invite them to witness your ceremonies where they can see their own, captives being sacrificed, and you say like, hey, don't F with us, this is what will happen to you, where it's kind of this very almost mafioso kind of thing, like, oh, it's a nice altar pet you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, kind of thing like that. But at the same point, a lot of this was not just go out and get blood and sacrifice, but a lot of it was like economically driven. And I think people find that a lot more, when they learn that, they find it a lot more understandable. Like, yeah, you were going out for like blood and glory, but you were also going out because like, hey, that's a great source of cotton over there. One of the earliest conquests outside the Valley of Mexico was the region which is now like the state of Morelos, which is called the Hotlands, because it's a little bit warmer than the climate of the Valley of Mexico, a little bit, lower down and kind of the heat and humidity there. So it's a little hotter, a little wetter, and you can grow some crops you can't really grow well in the Valley of Mexico. So it was their initial conquest is not to like go out and, get hearts, but to go out and find like a great place where they could get a good source of quality cotton, which kind of like undercuts a lot of the mystique about it when you learn like, oh, yes, they did have these institutions and they did have these, religious beliefs, but I mean, like, so did like the Romans who like went out and, conquered for blood and glory and then came back and, held triumphs where they, publicly executed people. There is this thing where, people always say like, well, all pre-modern societies were, brutal and bloody and all that. And it's like, I mean, all pre-modern societies are have some element of this, but at the same time, they're functioning societies. The average Roman didn't like wake up in the morning and say, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go like mess some people up for Ares, or see who I can bring back and, publicly strangle or throw in the Colosseum. The average Aztec citizen was waking up and being like, well, I've got to like, teach my kid, how to go fishing today, and then maybe bring in, some crops from my floating garden, and then I've got to help my wife, get some, some cotton that she can do some spinning on, and then later at night I might, teach my kids some songs. And then we've got a little nightly ritual and yada yada. It's like most people weren't waking up in the morning to go out and find somebody to sacrifice in the morning and then sacrificing somebody at night.
Hmm.
Now, I will say, it definitely happened, and I always see people saying like, well, you're just making apologetics for their human sacrifice. And for some people, human sacrifice is like a hard stop. They did human sacrifice, they're brutal, they deserve to be destroyed, period. And I can't argue with that, except to kind of point out that like, yeah, human sacrifice is very upfront, and very overt in Mesoamerican society. And again, the Aztecs turned it up to 11. But like if we go throughout human societies and in human cultures, literal human sacrifice is not exactly unknown. If we go from like Spartans and infanticide and leaving children out to die, to pharaohs burying their servants alive, or the Mongols executing people to make sure that Genghis Khan's tomb is never found, things like that. To various degrees of institutionalization, human sacrifice is pretty common throughout human history. If we go back to say like Mesopotamians, I always tell people like look to the Assyrians who they were a fully functioning society, and they were known as this incredibly brutal people who like the Aztecs, flayed people alive, things like that, to kind of show their dominance. And that was part of it, but they were still a functioning society where they had, their own rules and legal, institutions, and, their in-jokes, and they had games and things like that. So when we look at just, these very top-level elite institutions of war and sacrifice and politics and conquest, like we're not seeing the entirety of Aztec society. We're seeing just what the Aztecs wanted you to know about them because they wanted to, scare your breechcloth off. So the people who are like, oh, they were brutal, are really kind of succumbing to the Aztecs' own propaganda, where, yeah, sure, we're brutal. So when we come to your town and demand, that you pay us, tribute, you should do it, and that way we won't have to conquer you, and it's win-win. So, but that's not really the daily life of people. I'll link to a paper from this archaeologist called Elizabeth Broomfield, who looked at the way that once you get outside the major core cities of the Aztecs, like once you start doing archaeological digs outside of like Tenochtitlan and Texcoco and get more into kind of like, the suburbs and the smaller cities, you start to see a lot less kind of like iconography and statuary that's all really focused around like, this blood and sacrifice. And you get a lot more kind of like, crop goddesses and agricultural themes and things like that, which are really just more about like the people's daily life of like waking up, growing some maize, going back to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for trying to contextualize this. I mean, it's a whole, yeah, it starts to get emotionally charged. There starts to be, racial epithets thrown around. If you start to get into this, people deserve to be exterminated, blah, blah. You can do a whole bunch of, and especially YouTube comments makes it worse. So there's so much you can go into this. People misunderstanding it. It's dick measuring atrocities is never fun between cultures. But the response to kind of the question here is saying, yes, it did exist. There's always throughout history a context for everything, and there's a way to examine it and look at it without just necessarily being an apologist. And it's important, one, to understand it, and then two, not to allow it to cloud your vision of the entire society and write it off. And that's one of the main things we've been trying to get at with these videos. And kind of one of the things that I've been trying to turn my channel towards is getting away from high-level narratives about wars, etc. Excuse me, and getting more into like the ground ground eye view of everything. So that's what we'll be trying to focus more on here in the future, is like daily life of the Aztecs, the thing about like let's explore Tenochtitlan, all kinds of stuff like that is otherwise clouded, or your focus gets directed away by these night lightning rods. Sorry, we're at the end of 2 hours here. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much more to say about it. I think you talked about it well. There's a lot of papers and stuff. If people want to look more into the facts about it, we can link you to. But the main thing is, if you've made it this far in this particular video, I think you're one of the people who are interested in learning more and past it. And to conclude, I think we're going to be going into more of that kind of stuff on the daily life, other aspects of Aztec history, Mesoamerican history. And again, definitely take a look at the description below, where I'll be linking a lot of the stuff that Sean has talked about, lots of more resources. And hopefully, for those of you who are interested, like him, he doesn't have necessarily a degree directly in Aztec history, but with all the resources, it's pretty accessible, and you can start to dive into it and really learn a lot.
Some of it less accessible than some.
Right, yeah, some of it is hard, but I guess as we part here, do you have any comments specifically to the people, the demographic who would stick to the end of a video like this?
Well, man, I think the people who are going to stick to an end of a video like this, I don't think, I mean, you're there's nothing more I can tell you. We're already on the same page. I guess I would just point out that like it's really hopeful to see content creators like yourself who are making really kind of nice, serious, in-depth, well thought out, contextualized, and really just fascinating content on things that you don't really get to see. Like, I mean, if like a lot of people who are probably listening to this right now, like I grew up watching the History Channel and the Discovery Channel. And those things where it was like you could flip on a documentary and you'd see something that you'd never heard of before on some topic you didn't even know exist. That unfortunately doesn't really exist on the History Channel anymore. Mm-hmm. Now you get like house hunters and aliens or something like that. So it's really great to see people like yourself who are stepping up to kind of really look into the parts of history that that aren't just on World War II documentaries again. Or aren't on, complete nonsense like Ancient Aliens. So, thank you.
Yeah, and again, right back at you. I mean, what you guys are doing on Ask Historians and on the podcast and stuff like that has been invaluable. It's one of the things that inspired me to do the channel, engage with you guys, get you guys, a bigger megaphone, essentially. So yeah, again, to anyone who's here in the video joining us, definitely head on over to Ask Historians as well, so you can ask your own follow-up questions. It's a great resource. And Sean, what's your tag there again?
I am 400 rabbits on there, and I'm listed as one of the flared users. So you can always, if you can't necessarily find me as just by a search, you can always look on the list of flared users and find me there and send me a private message if you have questions, or just post a question and send me a private message and say, hey, go answer my question.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining us for this long video. And again, to everyone, we'll be back with some more content. So see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.